So, we are going to begin to look tonight in our second session at these twin enemies of those who wait on Christ to come. We've been waiting 2,000 years, but we have in particular been waiting for the last 3 years. You know what happened 3 years ago? The world changed. You know, there's certain moments in history when the world changed. Pearl Harbor, 9/11, COVID-19 changed the world probably in a bigger way than anything ever did. Except maybe the flood. The flood might have had more impact than that. But the two enemies are deceit and despair. Jesus warned us that deception would be great just before he comes back, and that's growing. But we're coming to a time when we're a little bit despairing as well. It seemed like he should come. It seemed like he should be here. It's time, yet he's not come. And this is a mirror of what happened with Israel when Moses went up to receive the Ten Commandments. Moses was a type of Christ, and in many different ways, as Joseph was a type of Christ. Moses went up to the mountain. He's gone a long time. People said he's not coming back. He's dead. And they had Aaron make them a golden calf, and they rose up to play. But then Moses came back, and he did not come with a good attitude. He was upset. And I fear that a lot of Christians, I don't know who's Christians and who's not, but those who appear to be Christians are going to be surprised at his coming because they've stopped looking for it. They have despaired. Absolutely. So we're talking about how we can keep from that and how we can wait further until he comes back. And I've told you since we began this study 3 years ago, almost 3 years ago, that while things are shaping up at breakneck speed, it's easily conceivable how the Antichrist systems could still take another 5 years to shape fully up. So no man knows the hour or the day. Jesus did say in Matthew 24:42 to watch. So I don't believe that we have permission to stop watching. He said watch, so we do what we do while we're watching. So, and this ties in to what we're facing in the church in America, the apostasy of the church, the Jesus movement, the Jesus people, and the movie that is coming out. It's out now, I guess. Yes, it's out. And as near as I can tell, I haven't seen the movie, but everything I could research about it, you should go see the movie. It will be very encouraging. It's not perfect. There are issues with it, but no glaring big deal. Watch it knowing that it is not a documentary. Okay? So it's telling the story. And from what I can tell, it does a pretty good job of that. But I mentioned last week, does that Jesus movement where scads and scads of long-haired, bearded people came to Christ back in the 60s, did that have anything to do with the lukewarmness that is the church today? I've prayed about it and I've researched it, and as near as I can tell, they did just as good as the church is doing today. Maybe better. Okay, we're not doing so great either. About 50% of the people you baptize will still be around a year later. That's been true for a long time. So the fact that these Jesus people, as they're called, came to Christ, it was really an amazing thing. So Chuck Smith was the pastor at Calvary Chapel. And during that time, there were a lot of hippies. Now, hippies need Jesus too, right? Amen. This is as bad as people who aren't hippies. So Chuck Smith is a hero. He did a really good job. He did a faithful job. And as near as everything I can tell, and I've listened to his sermons over the years, actually. He's with the Lord now. But he was an expository preacher. He took the Bible verse by verse. And even when all these hippies were coming in, and it must have been chaotic. I mean, it must have been just off the charts chaotic. They had 20 and 30 people living in a house here, and 20 and 30 living in a house there, and coming to Calvary Chapel and the discipling them and all the things. So that Chuck Smith continued to be expository, and the Calvary Chapel thing became a whole denomination, basically. There's Calvary Chapels all over America, all over Canada, maybe all over the world. I haven't researched it that close. And most of them, in fact, one preacher that I listen to about every week in research and preparation for the sermons that I put together, one of them is a Calvary Chapel pastor. Now, I've heard a couple of them who didn't do anything for me, but they were all sound in doctrine, for the most part. They're not Baptist. So Chuck Smith and Calvary Chapel, they were all up into, some of the gifts that Baptists aren't making too much of. Very Bible-based beginnings. The problem, and the reason why I'm bringing this up, not only the movie is out and I want to give you my opinion about it, but the devil, so Independent Baptists years ago used to have the premise they operated off from, that they would not do anything intending for it to be permanent. Their premise was everything man will do for God, and God will bless and make it a thing, ultimately man will pervert that, and the devil will get a hold of that. And so you don't do anything permanent. You plan on, and I think that's a pretty good premise, because that is what the devil does. And so there's a lot of Calvary Chapel that's really good, but something that we're going to talk about has gotten into it, and kind of a split has happened, and some things have gotten in there. But it was very Bible-based at its beginnings. And so the movie, the split resulting in influence of the New Apostolic Reformation. How many of you have heard and know what the New Apostolic Reformation is? Okay, I doubted anybody would know. And it's not going to be a danger for us as long as I'm pastor of the church, but it's affected in a huge way Christianity in America, and it's affected Calvary Chapel as well. Before we move on, I do want to hit on something. One of the the heroes of the early days of that Jesus movement was a guy who was left and right leading people to the Lord. And they make a real hero out of him in the movie. They leave out some things about him, and I hesitate to tell you what they are. The reason they probably made a good choice leaving his immorality later in life out is because it didn't happen during that time. It was later. So during the course of the story that's being told, Lonnie, what's his name? Lonnie. It left me. He was the kind of guy who he would hitchhike up and down California, and people would stop him and pick. And that was back in the days when hitchhiking was a thing. It's not a thing now, but he would get in, and people would, where are you going? Nowhere. I just like to hitchhike so I can talk to people about Jesus. That's fantastic. That's fantastic. So he led scads and scads of people to the Lord and did it very well. Later in life, he got into immorality, even into a homosexual relationship. Not even relationships. He would fall into that and repent of it, and it happened a few times. And that's why I told you last week, I had questions whether, God would use that. Well, he did, but we know how God feels about that, don't we? We know how God felt about David. David paid a huge price. God told David, okay, I'm not going to kill you. You're repentant. But the sword will never depart from your house. Yep. So we don't need to make a hero out of Lonnie. Okay? But he did, and on his deathbed, he was repentant. He died of AIDS. Okay, so this is left out of the movie, and I think it was probably a wise choice for the reasons that I told you. Chuck Smith was a hero. Chuck Smith and Calvary Chapel later, after all that story is done, kicked Lonnie out of the church. Church discipline. Which is what should be done. It may have been, something God used to bring him around, that he was repentant. Church disciplines, and that's the intent of church discipline. So let's talk about NAR. N-A-R. The New Apostolic Reformation. If I get to share this all with you tonight, you're going to be a little bit astounded about the impact. And I did not even know some of this was going on in the background. So in the 60s, roughly, we had the Pentecostal movement. 50s, 60s. But then along beyond that, late 60s and into the 70s, was the charismatic movement. But then after the charismatic movement, that gave way to what was called the third wave movement. And so each time this gets a little bit more perverted, a little bit more, until you've got Benny Hinn and Joyce Meyer and all of that crowd. That's the third wave movement. And so NAR is the next thing beyond that. And that's where we are today. So it is a movement that is hierarchical. That is, the whole thing is about influence and power. If you get anointed as an apostle in this movement, you have great authority and power. And some of the people, I've been listening to the testimony of those that have come out of this, and they said it was all about that. It was all about building you up and making you feel like you had great power and you could use that. And, people would use that for the right and wrong reasons. And revelation, new revelation. The Bible was great for its time, but I will prophesy over you and I will tell you now what's important for you to know from God, what He wants you to do. So you can see where there's great power in that. If you're a group of people who are agreeable to that, if you look on that person as an apostle or a prophet, and those are the two different categories, when they tell you something that God has told them over you, that becomes the thing. That becomes as authoritative as anything, even more than the Bible. And the difference now, as opposed to Joseph Smith or something like that, Joseph Smith was the guy, right? And if you were one of his entourage, you were a guy. But in this movement, there are these prophets and apostles all over the place. If you get anointed as one of them, then your job is to go to churches and tell them the stuff that God's telling you for them. It's hierarchical. That is true, yeah. But the difference, I think, is there's more power people in this thing than ordinarily you'd think of. And then the worship, they pervert worship in a terrible way. So Hillsong and Bethel. If you want to do any research on this, see what Hillsong and Bethel are doing. They have gone completely off the rails. There's witchcraft and all kinds of mystical stuff coming in that is of the devil, literally. Now, anything from Hillsong and Bethel from, as near as I can tell, 10 years ago and farther, it's good stuff. But man, the last several years, it's just off the rail, awful. So one of the things that you will hear about and see if you delve into this is that they believe in this thing of the 7 mountains of influence. A hierarchical theology of dominion. Dominion theology. This is kind of the next thing beyond dominion theology. Dominion theology says that man, it was intended for us to have dominion over the world. We're going to take that dominion in every area, not just in the church, in politics, in science. So there's 7 different mountains that we're supposed to be taking dominion over. Here are the 7 different areas of influence. Campus Crusade for Christ, Bill, what's his name? Bright. He actually started this. He kind of went off the rails before he died. And that whole thing just went badly. But it was a great organization until this. So here are, and I wouldn't argue that these are the mountains of influence. I would just say that it's not God's intention for the church to take that dominion and be over that now. It gets worse. Their intent with their dominion theology is that as they take control of these 7 areas, these mountains of influence, as we wrest that authority from the devil, as we take this world, Jesus will be here. That's the second coming. That's God's intent, is for us to take dominion back from the world, from the devil. And when we do, then Jesus in us, he will be here. So Jesus is returned by the way of Christians taking over governments and the world. Pat Robertson's been saying this stuff for 20 years. Pat Robertson and the whole CBN bunch. They're all up into dominion theology. You might not hear them talk about it every time, but that's their theology. In fact, that's the reason why Pat Robertson ran for president. So that we could take that hill, that mountain of authority back from the devil. How many of you, don't raise your hand, just answer this for yourself. How many of you thought when Trump was elected that we were going to get that power for the church back in America the way we used to have it? These folks did. And they were the driving force behind Trump running for president. These guys were in the White House. There were some real bad things going on behind the scenes that I didn't know anything about. And still is. Their intent is still to get Trump to run and we'll take power back for the church in America. That's their intent. Trump was thought to be that earthly leader that was to fulfill that. Doesn't make any difference whether he's a Christian. He was going to get that dominion back for us. Now, doesn't that just sour your vote for Trump? It sours mine. I'm glad I voted for him. I'm glad that he did most all the things that he did. Well, it comes out of a real good Bible example, Cyrus in the Bible. He wasn't a believer, and yet he's the one that allowed them to go back and rebuild Jerusalem. And there was another Bible character, a king over Israel, who, when you get to looking at it, he was a corrupt guy who Trump really just fit the bill for this guy. And yet he was used of God to keep the captivity from Israel for a short time because Israel didn't repent. And eerily, that's where we are in America today. America didn't repent. I believe that that's probably true. I believe that Trump was an opportunity for the church. It's gone. And I've always said, before he was running for his second term, I tried to warn people in conversations, even if Trump gets a second term, he could wind up being the worst thing for Christians ever.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Now, maybe he'll be good. I don't know. If he winds up being the nominee, I'll vote for him. I'm not voting for a Democrat. I don't care if they run Donald Duck. But I don't see him the way that I did. So these 7 mountains mandate is a hyper-focus. And Pastor Gibbs, some of you follow him, he's kind of allowed some speakers into his church that have this theology. I hope he's repented of that. Jan Markell kind of rebuked him for it. I hope he's learned his lesson. Anyway, they are hyper-focused on these 7 mountains, this dominion theology, that does not seem to have, now this is important, does not seem to have the centrality of Christ's atoning sacrifice as the central theme. That's not what they're all about. And yet they're coming into Calvary Chapel, and they're coming into all these different places trying to bring this power and get this authority in. I'll let you Google that because I don't know them and you don't know them. You can find out who they are. But Satan, Satan is behind it. And yet, I mean, it's all up into Bethel and Hillsong. You would not believe. We've talked a little bit about some of the witchcraft and some of the stuff that has entered. You know, Bethel and Hillsong, these are huge things, worldwide things. So just because a thing is successful does not mean it's of the Lord. The Independent Baptist principle, everything you do, you should figure it's temporary because it will eventually need to be destroyed and started over. Now, I don't think that has to be. You know, this church has been preaching the gospel for a long time right here, and we haven't changed our doctrine all these years.
And as long as we don't, we'll
Yeah.
be all right.
Yeah. So it does not have to happen. You know, Lonnie got off into that, but he didn't have to. It's a thing we need to be thinking about.
Yeah, you have to be constantly on guard
Yep.
to keep it from happening.
Yep, absolutely. So this movement, this Reformation, it would seem making disciples of, watch this, it would seem making disciples of unbelievers is not that's not the point. It's taking dominion from the devil and the world. I know you're sitting there thinking, how can a church or a Christian even be thinking that way? This is huge. A big movement. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's what the guys that have come out that were anointed as prophets or apostles, that's what they said. This is all about puffing me up, making me think I'm somebody. You know, and if that goes to your head, you know, you can play that act well. So, musico-spiritual warfare. Musical-spiritual warfare, that's what they call it. That proclaim the defeat of spiritual enemies and the taking back of territory for the glory of God, with songs being sung by children and preteens decked in matching camouflage outfits.
Wow.
Okay, this takes many different forms. Now I want you to watch. The devil does things by the smudging of the gray, as somebody said it. So, some of our old hymns do this same thing without the children walking in camouflage outfits. We're marching to Zion. Okay, we don't mean by that the same thing they mean by that.
Right.
So it's not that the words are so wrong, it's that what they mean by them is so wrong.
Absolutely.
So conceivably, we could sing some of those songs not even knowing what that writer meant by it or what they use it for, and we use it for worship. My dad came to me while we were talking years ago, and my brother, who's with the Lord now, I hope, he had a child, and they had their service that the Catholics do in their church. And Dad went to the service, and he told me later, he said, you know, that priest, he preached a sermon about grace. And I said, yeah, I'm sure he did, but you don't mean by that the same thing he means by that. That priest, and every Catholic sitting there knows he meant, that the grace of God comes by way of the Holy Roman Catholic Church through that priest to those parishioners. That's the avenue of grace. Well, Dad didn't know that. Of course, that's not what he thought it meant. So that's exactly right. They take those words and they mean something completely different by it. Yeah, and most of these songs that pervert this, you're probably going to recognize it too. I mean, we would recognize it if we heard them singing it. And now that you know, you certainly would. So when we sing and worship about taking dominion, which we don't, but taking territory, we have a spiritual flair to that. We have a spiritual understanding of that. That's what is different about not only those hymns, but anything that we would sing. That would be what's in our mind. The great debate that's going on right now is whether, how careful can you be? So, great debate among song leaders today. Now that good churches know how off the rails Hillsong and Bethel are going, they're wrestling with, do we want to even buy the songs that we do because they get revenue from these things? Okay, now I want you to think about something for a moment. Okay? I agree in theory that we shouldn't, but did anybody buy gas before they came to church tonight? Anybody here buy gas? I almost did, down at Quick Trip. I get my gas down at Quick Trip. Is that a good thing for me to give them profit? I mean, they sell liquor, they sell lottery, they sell... And I don't know what that corporation does. They probably support a whole bunch of gay stuff that I would... We're coming to a time you can't get away from it. You can't buy your groceries. You can't buy your gasoline. You can't buy Amazon stuff. You can't get away from it. I don't think you should even try. Let me give you an illustration, though, for you to wrestle with. So there are essentially two companies in the world that you can buy a computer from. Microsoft and Apple. Okay, the CEO of Apple is gay. Okay, and so I need to switch over to Microsoft. They're so much better. You see my point? You can't get away from it. And you know what Paul said about it? Paul said in Romans, talking about meat offered to idols. So just go down to it's just meat. Just go buy the meat. If it causes your brother to stumble, then deal with that relationship issue. And are they better?
I don't know about that.
That's what I'm saying. Is America better? I mean, think about where we've come to in this country. Are we really better? I know I'm gonna have to edit that out. And everybody's at different spiritual places. Well, and you get into a Pharisaical thing. I'm doing what they say is the right thing to do. And we do that. We should know we are keeping each other kind of accountable, and that's a good thing. And so we'll get to this next week because it's already after 8 o'clock. We'll continue to talk about this. A huge uncoupling or deglobalization, as they call it. I mean, we're decoupling from China, and it's going to cause us a great deal of pain because we have become. It's like you become dependent upon something and then you try to cut it off. Now we need to do that. I'm all for that. I'm just saying. The medication that you take. Anybody here take medication? You better pray we might make China too angry too quick. So we'll talk more about this next week because this is really the deglobalization that's taking place is having impacts worldwide. And I'm going to tell you about a guy, Peter Zion. Zion? I believe is pronounced. He is a globalist, a futurist. And he says China has 10 years. It's done. For several different reasons. We'll talk about that maybe next week. All right, we will bring this to a close then.